Hi, everybody, and welcome to a For Immediate Release interview. I am Shel Holtz in Concord, California, and I am thrilled to have with me today David Murray. David, I have known for, I haven't even tried to calculate how many years, probably the late 80s. Does that sound right?
Early 90s.
Early 90s. Okay. Yeah. It was that other guy at Reagan I've known since the late 80s. But yeah, you were at Reagan Communications when we met, and I think I was probably at, let's see, if it was the early 90s, I was at Alexander and Alexander. No, I was probably at Allergan.
That's where you were, Allergan.
Yeah. And corresponding with Reagan, and particularly the Reagan Report, which you were editor of, right?
By the mid-90s, I was editor of that, yeah.
Right. And we're talking today because you are the brand spanking new author of This, An Effort to Understand, which I have read and thoroughly enjoyed. I did not agree with absolutely every word, but I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. I have to say, right off the top, David, you are a hell of a writer. So enjoyed that part immensely and didn't disagree with everything, but we're going to spend the hour talking about the book. But first, my introduction is by no means comprehensive. So can I ask you to share your bio with people? Sure.
I'm the son of two writers. My mother and father were both writers. My dad was in advertising. My mother was a novelist. Went into the family business, went into trade journalism in the 90s at Reagan Communications, covering the PR and corporate communication and speechwriting worlds, and then did a lot of other journalism. Sort of in my 30s, I did a lot of local and national journalism of all kinds, writing in the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune and Chicago Magazine, and places like that. And then I've kind of, when you're getting old when you start just counting your career in decades, not even in years. And so then the next decade, sort of in my 40s, I kind of really started working on creating, helping to consolidate this community of speechwriters. Some speechwriters came to me sort of early in the last decade and said, you've known us for a long time. I was by that time the editor of this magazine called Vital Speeches of the Day, which is one of the oldest continuously published magazines in the world. Goes back to 1934, and I was the editor of that. And I've been around these speechwriters one way or another for a number of years, and they came to me and said, "We don't have an association. There's no place for us to go. There's no conference for us to get together and really know each other. There's some other events, but there's no home for us." And I thought, what a dumb idea. Let's create an association of like lighthouse operators. But I did, and it has sort of grown into a real institution, and it's grown beyond just speech writing. And we have an executive communication council. And so we really talk about all matters leadership communication at our website, prorhetoric.com. And then, of course, all this time I've been writing about communication. It's been a subject that's fascinated me my whole life. And the book that you're looking at is kind of a collection of essays on a certain topics that I've been really writing since about I'd say before the Obama administration even. So that's kind of where we are and where I am today.
You mentioned that there was no association for speechwriters, and yeah, I want to get into the book right away, but that prompted a question because I have had many invitations to join the National Speakers Association.
Yeah.
Is there any dovetailing between those two organizations?
You would think there would be, because they seem to be so related, but the two cultures are so different. National Speakers Association are people who want to make a living giving speeches. And so it's sort of a show business kind of operation. There's not very much talk about the crafting of speeches.
And they're not writing speeches for other people, right?
They're writing speeches for themselves, but they don't even, there's not even a culture there of thinking about the craft of creating. Like if you were going to write a stump speech and give it to make a living all over the country, wouldn't you want that speech to be perfect and structured well? They have no thought about that. They're always just talking about sort of body language and kind of the show part. And then meanwhile, and we have some crossover people. There's a woman named Patricia Fripp, who you might know, who's in the Bay Area. She's wonderful. She was the past president of them. But then, of course, there's the speechwriters who can't be. They just can't be bothered to deal with those professional speakers. And there's a prominent British speechwriter who once said, "Oh, those professional speakers, they've written more books than they've read." I always am trying to get together with these people, but the cultures just never quite mesh.
Okay, well, we're going to get into our discussion, but first I want to let people who are watching in real time know that they can ask questions using the comment feature on YouTube. Just write your comment. I'm going to see it, and I can throw it up to David. But I have plenty of questions of my own, starting with, you mentioned that it's a book of essays. And I told you when we were in the virtual green room before we started broadcasting that the last book of essays I read was by Joan Didion, probably when I was in college. You don't see this a lot, books of essays anymore. And I think that's a shame. What led you to approach this as a book of essays as opposed to making your point, chapter by chapter?
Well, partly it's just how it came about. It's really a collection. I've written a daily blog since 2008, and I've written 3,500 blog posts. And people say, "Wow, this book is really these essays are really well written." Well, if you write 3,500 blog posts, you ought to be able to come up with 50 good essays out of those. And I think of it actually. I mean, people call it essays, and 50 essays sounds like a horrible nightmare long thing to read, but they're more like column length. I think. So I think of it almost as a collection of columns. And I guess I wrote it as a collection of columns, or collected it that way, because for lack of a central revolutionary theory about communication. I think what I have is, a lot of ideas about communication, a lot of personal experiences with communication, a lot of insights from communicators I've known in the corporate world, in the journalism world, in the oral history world over all these years. So I have a lot of insights and stories to tell that do kind of amount to an effort to understand. And they all do fit under this label, but I don't have a master theory, I think. And so I don't know if you should have a master theory on this stuff. So I think it came together pretty well. I wasn't always sure that it would, as I thought about collecting these, but I think they hang together pretty well. I hope so.
They do, and it must have been a lot of work to go through all of those, select the ones that you wanted to incorporate, and then organize them in this sequence that made sense, going from individual to organization and beyond.
I was alone in my office for 10 straight days. There was no alcohol that week. There was no nothing that week. That was once I had the essays together, there was a week. There was 10 days of just absolute concentration. So that's what it took.
Did you write any of these just for the book, or did you massage any of them for the book?
Oh, they're very much edited for the book. Few of them are in exactly the form that they were on the blog, and then the introductions were written just for the book. And there's definitely a lot of original material in there.
Hey, we have a question from a viewer, and it is Robert Holland. Who says, David, you make a strong case that employee communications is a dying breed. My words, not yours. My experience in my work is that it's not so much dying as evolving. What needs to change for it to survive?
Well, I don't think it's dying either. I think, and I'm very interested to hear what Robert thinks is happening in employee communication. So I've been fairly far removed from employee communication, I'd say, for the last decade or so or more. And this goes to a larger discussion, and one that Shel and I have been having since the 90s. But, when I came into the business and started really covering employee communication in the 90s, employee communication was a bunch of ex-journalists who were wanting to this is how it seemed to me, and who were wanting to basically do what journalism does, but inside organizations. So they wanted to democratize the organization, just like journalism democratizes a society by informing people about what's really happening. That's what employee communication people, that's what employee publication editors were trying to do with letters to the editor section, editorials, upward communication, coverage of the company's financials. They were all trying to do that inside organizations, and it seemed like a very idealistic and exciting, and in some cases a subversive pursuit. And I loved that, of course. I was a young guy who was trying to make an impact in the world too. So I loved covering that. I loved highlighting great examples. I mean, there was a utility publication at the time, I remember, and it was an employee magazine, and it said, "We have bad morale. Whose fault is it?" Right on the cover of the magazine. That was like exciting to watch people try to do. And I felt, and this is one of the reasons that Shel and I started we don't call it a frenemyship, but it's one of the reasons we started having conversations in the late 90s. I felt like this technology that was coming in 1995, basically everybody realized, oh my gosh, there's this thing called email. There's this thing called the web. We've got to keep up, and we got to catch up, and we got to figure all this out. And it felt to me like a lot of people dropped everything to figure out how to deal with it, how to create an intranet, how to do all this stuff. And they stopped during that, they stopped thinking about all these other issues. And that's oversimplifying the case for sure. But the business got less interesting to me. By the early 2000s, you would never see a headline like "bad morale, whose fault is it?" It seemed to me, and I wasn't seeing that. And so I wasn't seeing the kind of idealistic work and almost not anti-management work, but like people really negotiating with management fundamentally about how to do employee communication. That was what interested me about the business. And I sort of left the business around that time. I stopped paying attention to it, and I started paying attention to speech writing and other stuff. So I don't think the business is dying, and I'd really be curious. And Sharon McIntosh, who I think is on the call today, she and I are about to announce an executive communication, employee communication summit that we're going to be holding in June to talk about these things and to figure out where employee communication really is, and where and how it's really merging with leadership communication. So this is a huge subject and something I care about a lot. And so I'm right now at this moment where I'm curious to hear from Robert Holland about where he thinks it's going, or anybody for that matter. And we're going to be talking to a lot of people about that at that conference.
Great. And we'll probably get back into that. I want to get back to my questions and back to, helping you sell your book. You got some amazing testimonials on there. I mean, you got Mike DeWine, you got David Petraeus, you got who was my son's ultimate boss, by the way, at some point when he was in the Army during Operation Iraqi Freedom. You got James Clapper. And I have to mention that you also got Phoebe Judge. I'm a huge criminal fan, so I was really impressed. How did you get names like this?
I can tell you how I got Phoebe. I've known her since she was about 14 years old. Tony Judge worked at Reagan, and he's one of my dear friends, and he's her father. So I've known Phoebe a long time, and I was really pleased not only to get her, but that my publisher decided to put her like very on top of the book. She was like, I would have put Petraeus up there, but or maybe she thought the governor was. But I got most of these in different connections. I got some of them through their speechwriters. I've published a number of DeWine's speeches. DeWine really is a good speaker, and his speechwriter, he and his speechwriter have been collaborating together for 25 years, and they've got I think a colorful relationship. So I know the speechwriter, and but she put it in his hands, and he was like up late one night reading it, and that was also the case with Clapper. These weren't just like, let the speechwriter. These people actually read the book, which really made me happy. And then Petraeus, I've had a great and wonderful history with, and a meaningful history with his one of his direct reports. This Army Lieutenant Colonel named I'm blanking on his name. It's on my book. Mark. Oh, this is terrible. Hang on a second. I can't let this drop.
I'm looking.
Sorry. Mark Webber. Mark Webber. I co-wrote a book with the guy. I can't not know his name. So
David, I have to tell you, you talked about measuring your career in decades. It's going to get worse.
It's gonna is that we're going to be using like quarter.
I'm telling you from experience, that'll get worse.
Got it. Well, it's happening. Not only I can see the book, but I couldn't read the name because my eyes are going bad. So no, Mark Webber, who really, we wrote this book together, and he reported directly to Petraeus, and Petraeus appreciated my working with, because Mark Webber was dying of cancer, and we wrote this thing, this memoir for his called "Tell My Sons: A Father's Last Letters," and it was this completely searing relationship, and it was like one of the most meaningful things that ever happened to me. But David Petraeus was so grateful that I helped him with that book, that he was just basically willing to do anything for me. He spoke at my first World Conference. He said, I just mentioned that I was having, and he said, well, I'm going to be in New York at that time. Would you like me to speak? Yeah, I'd like you to speak.
Let me think about that.
Yeah, and he had been a speechwriter in an earlier part of his career, so he really had something to say about it. So he's a guy who has helped me out a number of times, and he really likes me, and I've actually worked with him on some strategy stuff. So but most of these relationships probably came because I know a lot of speechwriters, and I sort of have access.
We have another question. This from Peter John Dean. David, as I understand it, you wrote these essays over quite a long period. Did you find your thinking evolved over time? And if so, how?
I mean, it didn't. Yes, my thinking has evolved a lot in the last 15 years, as Shel Holtz might be the best witness of. The main way that my thinking has evolved from 20 years ago, when I was like publicly, I was kind of trying to be a bomb thrower 20 years ago. My first boss, Larry Reagan, had P.T. Barnum's philosophy, which is if you want to draw a crowd, start a fight. And Larry was a little bit, I think, more careful about what kind of fights he started than I was. I really liked provoking fights. I liked provoking communicators and other readers to have really intense discussions. And as Shel probably remembers well, I would say rude things and write rude things to kind of spark these things. And that's in the tradition of H.L. Mencken. That's in the tradition of Hunter S. Thompson, all these people who I admired and used to love to read. I would say that what I've learned, or not what I've learned, but what I've just observed pretty much since Obama was getting elected, and certainly in the last 4 or 5 years. H.L. Mencken said he used to start these things to stir up the animals. That was his phrase, and just trying to stir up the animals. Right now, the animals are already stirred up. And there are times and there are places where really provocative invective is needed. You got to shake people up. And I've done some of that, not just for ill, I've done it for good. But I will say that I do much less of it now. I think I do. And I don't do it. I certainly don't do it gratuitously, and I don't do it to start a fight or to draw a crowd. I honestly, I think that what this society needs now is much more love and much more trying to understand one another, and much more explaining to each side of a certain debate what they have in common than driving wedges.
And you also you inherited that at the Reagan Report, though, because Larry started that. Hugh Iglarsh was the one who prompted me to write a letter to the editor saying, I think you're out of your mind, before you were the editor. So look, you inherited that approach.
Did start it, and Larry once said in the 70s, and we'll forgive him because he's dead, and we'll forgive him because it was the 70s, but he did write something in the Reagan Report in which he basically said that all women sound the same on the phone. All PR women sound the same when they call him on the phone. He received letters from 2/3 of the Reagan Report's readers.
That's because 2/3 of all communicators are women,
Well, there's that, right? But like, to get a letter from 2/3 of your readership back when people had to type it up and fold it up and put it in that's got to be a record. So yes, we come from a tradition of that, and that's part of that's part of it. But the communication business was at the time, it was super stuffy, just like all of corporate America was. And I'm proud to be part of that tradition. It's just that in the last 12 years, I've been focusing on other things, and I think for a good reason.
Well, this book clearly is about communication, two-way communication, designed to try to, and I love the title of the book, and I understand why you use the title. But what I tell people, and I've used this in a number of presentations and articles I've written, is that years ago, one of my side interests is early American history. And I was reading a book that cited an early French explorer on the North American continent. And the translation said that he came to a place, this was in his journal, he came to a place where one river communicated with another. And I went, oh, I haven't heard that use of the word communication before. But what it meant was they became a common river. The root of the word, probably going back to Latin, is to make common, to be on the same page, which is the point of communication. So this one-way communication where you are reporting, I've started referring to that as messaging. That's not communication. There's nothing wrong with messaging. Right. But don't call it communication. I wonder, for purposes of your book, how do you define communication?
I mean, I define it exactly the same way. And I think that's one of the, I think we actually have harder time getting that through to people in our business than people outside of our business. Because we are called corporate communicators, and we think that, and so that starts to become synonymous with broadcasting, with putting messages out. Because if that's how we define what we do, well, then that's what communication must be. I use the word commune. If you're trying to commune with a person, that's in the word. And if you're communing with somebody, that means at least 50% listening. And in fact, it means doing more than just listening. It means again, trying to understand, which is like, I'm listening to your words, Shel, but I'm also watching your body language. I'm taking into account everything I know about your whole life story. I'm sensing the mood in which you're saying it. I'm trying to use my imagination to kind of to really think about what you're saying. I'm trying to get in your soul to some extent, and I'm trying to get you into mine. And that is a lot different than just broadcasting.
Well, I'm reading a book right now. It is called Think Again, by a fellow named Adam Grant. And he cites research that says that people who are raised in a home where the parents argue, not fight, mind you, but argue, debate, become pretty good at engaging in the kinds of conversations that are fruitful and produce the kinds of outcomes that are worth having that debate. You have that kind of background.
I actually don't. My parents. I'm trying to think about that, but no, as I remember it, my parents only fought like once a year, but it was like World War III. And the first time I remember them fighting is I remember being at the top of the stairs, and she was a Democrat and he was a Republican. And they were always just basically fine to cancel each other's vote out. But in 1976, he said he liked Carter. He thought Carter was a good man. And they'd just been coming off Watergate, and my mother allowed herself to hope that he was going to vote for Jimmy Carter. And I remember being at the top of the stairs. I was 7 years old, and hearing my mother in the kitchen screaming at my dad, "Jerry fucking Ford!" So I'm trying to figure out where I got this enjoyment of arguing. I think I didn't. I think what I really like to do is to write and argue in writing. I'm happy to argue in person over a drink, but I think what I really enjoy is putting forth a crisp argument and letting people react to that.
I was on the high school debate team. That's where I learned, that was able to translate that into writing. So going back to our definition of communication, there are many kinds of communication. You and I, and by the way, I really enjoyed your post reminiscing about us. You talked about the time we went for a ride in your Scout. I was remembering the time we spent an entire evening drinking at the Billy Goat.
Oh, yeah.
It was a good evening. And, that kind of communication is one kind. Employee communication is another kind. And you have an essay in the book that says communication can't be strategic or measured. I would say that you and I having this conversation probably can't be measured, although we will see how many people watch the video and listen to the audio. But in terms of an objective for this, the objective here is for us to have a conversation and for people to hear you. I went into this knowing we would achieve that objective short of an internet failure, right? Yeah. But in this chapter, you make the case that communication, you can't go into it if you know what the outcome is going to be, and it certainly can't be measured. Can you talk about that? And it's a short essay.
Why don't I just read the essay and then we can talk about it?
We're going to get a reading from David Murray, ladies and gentlemen.
Let's do that.
Just picture yourself in a bookshop with a lot of chairs out there.
There you are. The title of this essay is "If You Know How It's Going to Turn Out, It's Not Communication." There is propaganda, there is persuasion, there is publicity, but there is no strategic communication, despite what so many marketing conference titles promise, any more than there is strategic love. Someone who would propose to communicate strategically is like the misguided artist described by the writer George Saunders. We buy into some version, this is Saunders, we buy into some version of the intentional fallacy, the notion that art is about having a clear-cut intention and then confidently executing same. The actual process, in my experience, is much more mysterious and more of a pain in the ass to discuss truthfully, Saunders says. This is me again. The idea is ridiculous, that one can flap one's lips or tap one's computer keys with an expectation of orderly intent, smooth execution, and a measurable outcome. If communication were anything like that, I reckon I wouldn't be as interested in it as I am, or as afraid of it. I dread a business cocktail party, even though I'm the extroverted head of a professional communication association. Everyone dreads a business cocktail party. That's why they let you drink. I know an outgoing industry rec on tour like me who once found himself in a buzzing ballroom and panicked. He answered his wallet and ran out the door pretending it was an emergency call. It was an emergency call. I dread a lunch with someone I don't know. I usually arrive 30 minutes early, 10 to be safe, plus 20 more to psych myself up in the parking lot. And looking at our menus and deciding what we want, this is what Emily Dickinson would call the hour of lead. I dread almost all telephone conversations. How many times have I readied myself for a big call, even one that could offer a real opportunity if it goes well, and as the phone rings on the other end, I find myself hoping Oprah won't pick up after all, and I can just go back to my regular day. That's because I dread communication. I dread it like I dread a long run in January because of the energy I know it will demand and the pain it will entail. I dread it because at least half of it is out of my control, which means all of it is out of my control. I dread it because it happens so fast and because it can get out of hand and it can go all the way bad. I dread it because it involves electrical impulses and rhythm and bodily fluids and God knows what else. I dread it because it is unpredictable, like a big argument with your spouse, or sex with your not spouse, or opening the thick envelope, or hearing the test results, or mysterious feet on the stairs, or death itself. I dread it because it is communication, and I love it because it is communication. But if it's not a little scary, it's not communication. And if it is communication, it sure isn't strategic. So, are you there, Shel? Okay.
I am here, yes.
Okay. So I guess the what I would add to that is that I think we have to define what strategic means and what communication means. And what you're saying is a conversation like this is communication. And what about that do you object to?
I object to nothing about that when you're talking about those kinds of communications. When I come home and find that my wife is upset about something that I didn't anticipate, and we have a conversation, I can't be strategic about that communication other than knowing that what I'm saying, I am trying to resolve, as is she. Right. Yeah. But I don't know the next thing that's going to come out of her mouth. She doesn't know the next thing that's going to come out of mine. I think organizational communication is different because you start with an objective, right? Well, first of all, there's an overarching objective because the company wouldn't pay for a communicator if they didn't think that communication was going to have a positive outcome for the organization, that the organization's business goals wouldn't be well served by having that communication. So thus we have to become strategic in order to demonstrate that we can produce those kinds of results. And I would argue that after I read that chapter, it seemed like every other chapter I read, every other essay or column I read in the book was contrary to the message in that chapter, because it talked about how you do get to an outcome, a desirable outcome. Even talking about speechwriters saying, I want the audience to believe this or think this or take that action, and then I'm going to craft a speech that is going to move them in that direction. That is strategic. I could measure that easily. I could have little reader audience response cards in the seats, as so many conferences do, and ask them what they got out of the speech. That's measurement. And when I, and for those who are watching or listening who don't know, I am director of internal communications for a $2 billion company. And I would say that everything we do is strategic. It's journalistic. It's not journalism, obviously, but we take a journalistic approach to the writing that we do. We do more than that, though. We facilitate the communication between people and between departments. When we introduce a program, we want people to support it and not oppose it, and some of them tend to be controversial. Just how do you feel about that notion that organizational communication is communication, but it's different from interpersonal communication?
I think it's different. I'm certainly not arguing for people to be disorganized. I'm certainly not saying that there shouldn't be purpose in communication. In fact, I do want to get to a place on the other side of this where I think that actually interpersonal communication, especially online, should be more purposeful, actually, and almost to say strategic. So we'll get to there. I realize this is we are splitting some hairs here. I'll give you an example, though, of where I think that this term of strategic communication, and probably the bone I was really trying to pick in this essay, where I think strategic communication started to get out of hand. And I remember a time when we were talking about employee new magazines and newsletters, the good old days, as I call them. There was this idea that came forth that every article should have this rubric next to it that would say, okay, we have 5 strategies that we're trying to do in internal communication, and every article in the employee publication has to correspond with one of those strategies, and each article is going to have a rubric next to it that's going to say, this one is to promote wellness, and this one is to promote corporate financial literacy, and this one is and I thought, you people have completely lost the narrative here. It seemed too cut and dry, too just sort of blockheaded. There's an overall purpose for the magazine and the publication, and that's basically to enlighten employees about what's going on in the organization and to enlighten management about what's going on with employees. So I just think it got a little too pinheaded for a while, and I'm starting to see some stuff that happened in the last year, and I'll give you two examples of stuff that two things that were done by organizations that I admire that do not fall into the strictly strategic bucket, and we can argue that. One is listening sessions. There's a big corporation who I admire who, before George Floyd and certainly after George Floyd, just started having these all-company listening sessions. We're going to be hearing from them at our summit in June. And the entire thing was simply listen. We don't know what employees are going to say. We don't know how they're going to say it. We're going to say nothing in return. What's the purpose of this? Well, you could say the strategy of it is just to listen or to collect feedback. Fine, then that's a strategy. But it was just, why are you doing this? Because we think we should, because we think we need to hear, period.
I would point out that the original concept of the town hall was not for the leaders of the town to present to the residents. It was for the residents to tell the leaders what was on their minds.
Yeah.
And that was kind of perverted in the corporate world. Where I work, we've turned it back to what it originally was. We do have some leadership presentations because there's stuff that they need to present. But most of it is the employees asking questions. We do have 3 questions, by the way, from viewers. So let's go to those, starting with Robert Holland regarding strategic communication. How do you account for the difference between Trump's communications about COVID-19 and Biden's? Different comms for different purposes with different outcomes.
I'm not sure how to answer that exactly. I think that I actually don't know how to answer that question. I don't, because I don't know how to answer that question.
Well, let's go to
Robert, if you want to clarify that, I'm happy to.
Robert, if you want to elaborate on that, go ahead. In the meantime, Chip Griffin says any kind of strategic planning management process can be taken to extremes, but it doesn't mean the idea is bad.
Of course not. And I spend a lot of time telling executive communication operations, which often are the least strategic operations in an organization, because a lot of executive communication happens because somebody's sorority or fraternity buddy invited them to go speak somewhere, and now we have a speechwriter working on it. So no, I definitely, I really spent a lot of time talking about how to organize a corporate communication department. I'm not saying it should be completely willy-nilly, but I think it should have room. I think it should have room for people who have instincts that something needs to happen. I'll give you just one more example. Diane Suhetka at this Metro Hospital in Cleveland, she's a former newspaper reporter. She doesn't even talk in terms of strategy. I think she thinks pretty strategically, but she doesn't always talk in terms of strategy. And she's also going to be at our summit. After George Floyd, the CEO came out and made a statement about George Floyd and about what this meant to the organization and our values, and as every CEO did. But then CEOs kept going, well, I don't know what else to say about this. I came out and gave the statement. And Diane's instinct was, the last thing we need to hear is more stuff from the CEO. We need to hear from employees. So she just went out into the workforce and started finding people who had stories to tell about what it's like to be Black and work at this organization. And she just simply Studs Terkeled it. She just made a bunch of these videos. They're so moving. So what was her strategy? Well, her strategy was, yes, she could say, well, yes, I was just trying to give voice to people in the organization. Why? What's the measurable outcome of that? I don't know what the measurable outcome of it. I'm just telling you, I know that that's what our organization needed, to give voice to people.
Sure, and trust, of course, and the Edelman Trust Barometer reinforces this frequently, says that frontline workers are among the most trusted people in the organization. You mentioned that Sharon McIntosh was watching today. She has a question for you. What recommendations would you share with chief communication officers who are overseeing internal and external communications in this age of extreme division and heightened emotion?
Wow. Read my book. Have me come in and talk to your people. I actually am going to be doing book talks inside organizations for groups of communicators, because I do think that I think that communicators we think we all share these ideas in common, and some of us do, and some of us don't yet. So I really would say, aside from bringing me in, get your people culturally literate on the same page. I think that leaders right now, corporate leaders, are going through something that they are not prepared for to the extent that we've never seen. I mean, if you think of what the CEO of a company like UPS needed to know and be conversant about and talk about publicly 15 years ago, 10 years ago, there were two things. They had to know how to talk about financials, and they had to know and talk about global logistics. Those were the subjects they had to master. They were the CEO of UPS. Now the CEO of UPS has to talk about the environment, has to know how to talk about social issues, has to be, these people are being whipsawed, especially in Georgia right now, about electoral politics and voting reform. And voting rights laws. Because of the dearth of common national leadership, people have started to turn to these leaders on issues that these leaders have absolutely no educational or professional preparation for. Who does? Well, who are the wonderful liberal arts students that populate the top parts of these organizations? That's us. And we, meanwhile, have trained ourselves over the last, over our whole careers, to be really polite and diplomatic with top management, to be deferential, to never suggest the same thing twice. And I think we have to uneducate ourselves in that area and realize that in some ways we're more prepared on these issues, and we've got to be more prepared. We've got to be more culturally literate than CEOs, because we have to support them, and they need help. They truly need help on these issues.
Yeah. Two quick comments from Chip Griff. It's actually one comment broken into two on YouTube, but he says, as someone who lives in a place governed by town meetings, I can tell you that it isn't really a great model for governing or communications. Town meetings, governmental or corporate, don't necessarily reflect the information wanted or needed by most constituents. And I can tell you that that's something that I've been working to overcome, to make sure that we find out what people want to know about before we set the agenda for these meetings, so that we are responsive to the interests of the stakeholders.
Yeah, and I don't know if Chip is saying that he doesn't think listening sessions are a good idea. What I know about this organization, and they'll be talking about it themselves this summer, is that they feel it's bought them an incredible amount of goodwill, because they've simply let people say exactly what's on their minds, and they've sat there and they've listened, and then they use the comments that they hear. They quote that back. They say, we've heard this, and because we've heard this in these words, we are doing this. And they just have this real feeling that it has just bought them so much. So I don't know, I hear what Chip's saying here, and I don't think it's the total form of governing for this organization, but it's been very valuable for them.
And he says that he likes listening sessions for goodwill. Robert has elaborated on his point. He says, the point simply being what Shel was pointing out, comms can be used to achieve different goals. If comms can't be strategic, how do you account for such widely different approaches and outcomes? Again,
there's communication, and then there's persuasion, and then there's propaganda, and then there's all sorts of things that we do. I'm defining communication as what Shel was talking about, is the two rivers coming together. And if I'm truly having an interaction with you that has to do with trying to understand your soul, trying to join our souls together, it's corporate communication. You can call it corporate communication, but it's a different definition of communication.
Question from somebody else, Molly Walker. Enjoyed the book. And for me, she says, you wrote very successfully about how to engage people in real conversations and how you take offense with civility. Can you talk a little bit about that? And this is a great question, because I had this question on my list. Neville, my co-host on FIR, Neville and I recently interviewed Jolie Odell, who is the current president of Civilization, and Andrea Veckerle, who is the founder and immediate past president. Civilization, of course, is all about encouraging civil dialogue online as opposed to the attacks that we see in a lot of places right now. So can you talk a little bit about that? You had a chapter in which you sort of attacked the idea of civility.
And let's leave that question up there if we can, so that I can come back to exactly that question, because I want to. But let's start with the online stuff, because that pairs with a point I wanted to make about how I think we should be more strategic in our personal communications. You know, I see people doing things online that all day I want to write to them direct messages. Why did you post that? What were you trying to have happen based on you're posting that? And honestly, Shel, I've seen you post some stuff that I've thought, by posting that, is he trying to get people to, if I asked him what the purpose of posting that is the purpose I just needed to vent? Or is it I am trying to, stir up my own buddies to go vote? Or is it and are those two things worth what it might do, which is really make somebody, more in their bunker on the other side? And I have tried to train myself in this moment to always know what I'm posting and why I'm posting it, what I'm hoping to get out of it, and hoping to do as little harm with it as possible. And I do think that's really important. And I think thinking about and I just had to vent is not a good enough reason these days. I don't think it is. And so, we make excuses. Here comes a rant. Why are you ranting? Ranting is bad. You know that? And so anyway, so that's my thought on that. In terms of civility, and we can get back to that, but in terms of civility versus what I call civil communication, what I say in the book is that civility is by itself doesn't get anything done. It's I've been around a lot of civil people who hated my guts. Civility in the book, I say, is a hiss. Civility is staying together for the kids, even though the house is still just totally filled with tension and the kids are dying from it. That's what civility is. And that's not going to save our country. That's not going to save our society. Just basically standing there and saying, I hate your guts, but I'm not going to tell you unless maybe I've had a little too much to drink, and then I will tell you. What we need is civil communication, which is, I'm thinking often about the spirit of Studs Terkel, who I knew in Chicago before he died. I got to know him a little bit, and I saw him. I've seen him on film, and I've seen him in person. He was a socialist, and he was a very serious socialist. He was non-moderate, but his main job and his main life was interviewing people and getting people to say what was in their soul about their work, about racism, about war, about every big subject under the sun. And he could sit down with a jackhammer operator, and he could sit down with the CEO of an oil company. And he basically came with the attitude of, hey, you've been on this planet for 50 years. What have you been through? Where did you come from? How did you come to your attitudes? Who are you? And there was always this basic assumption that people had been on a long journey, that they'd seen a lot and they felt a lot, and they got to where they got, even though it's a far place from where Studs lived somehow. And maybe they'd gotten there at least as honestly as he got to where he got. And I think that basic philosophy, that's what civil communication is. It's like communication with love rather than just polite. Politeness is too shallow for the place we're in now.
Right. I'll answer your question, by the way.
Yeah.
My goal with these posts, I see two. One, something I learned in high school debate is evidence matters. Just throwing a thought out there, unsupported by evidence, won't win a debate. And this may be off base in today's world, but we won debates because we convinced a judge who knew that there had to be evidence to support your argument. So when I find something that supports an argument, I share that, and Yeah, rant. The other is that I'm not trying to change anyone's mind. You see all the jokes about, wow, all the minds that have been changed by these discussions on Facebook. Yeah, I know I'm not going to do that. I'm hoping to keep the people who agree with me engaged, not with me, but the topic, because if everybody gets complacent, we could go backwards. So these are
yeah.
what whether I succeed at that or not, I don't know. I'm not measuring it.
Yeah, I mean, look, how do you decide though where to begin and where to end at this point? Like, I also try to think a lot about, like, what do people turn to me for expertise on? They turn to me, I guess, for expertise on communication, and that's about it. Nobody cares what my theory is about, the political. The prospects of the politics in the state of Wisconsin this year, like, and so I guess what I'm saying is I'm asking for less purposeful communication in the corporate world, not less purposeful, more imaginative and more free, creative communication in corporate communication, and going with your gut. And I'm looking for more careful and measured communication, because I really do think that saying stuff online, I think we do this thing in magical thinking about online communication all the time. I post something and I'm thinking, oh, Shel's going to love this. My buddy Shel's totally going to love this. And you have a huge bunch of friends online. You have 1,000 people or 500 people online. You're pissing off some of those people, and it matters that you're doing that. And maybe sometimes it's worth it to do that. But I think you have to think about those people every time, and I think often we don't. We just kind of imagine that our buddies are gonna see stuff, and I think that does matter a lot.
By the way, you talk about persuasion as being something other than communication, other than persuasive communication, and that's splitting hairs. Have you heard of this technique called motivational interviewing?
No.
This is the idea. It was I think one of them was a psychologist who came up with this approach that said, if you really want someone to change their mind, you can't convince them by throwing arguments at them. That just makes them dig in more. You've said that. But you can help them come to the realization on their own by asking questions that lead them to their own conclusion. You can't even ask questions that lead them down a path that you have predetermined. You just ask questions that help them think through an issue and go, oh, wait a minute, maybe.
You might not be trying this technique on me, are you here, Shel? Now, come on.
This is just a conversation. I was reading one tale about a black musician who actually hangs out with KKK Grand Wizards. And by getting them to know him, they change their minds. They've actually... one of them quit the KKK and sent his robes to him, to the musician. So, I mean, there are ways that you can change people's minds if that's what you want to do through real communication.
Yeah, I don't disagree. If I didn't think that was basically true, I wouldn't be here.
Well, what has happened to debate, the kind that you wrote on Writing Boots the other day, that most of our stuff is lost to history, old CompuServe discussions. I pointed you to an open letter I wrote to you at one point. This was on technology. We only have about 7 minutes left, so I don't know if we're going to get to technology. Maybe we can do this again someday. Yeah. But what's happened to the idea of having a debate? It's again what Adam Grant calls the difference between relationship conflict and task conflict. That everybody has to make it personal now. You and I could have some heated debate over the issues that we were talking about, and then go drink at the Billy Goat Tavern and have a wonderful evening.
Yeah, I actually explore that in the book, and I lament that in the book, and I don't fully come to answers. I think some of it has to do with, I think people feel less. I mean, I don't think people felt very secure with their jobs in the 90s, but I feel people seem less secure about their jobs. It's not just that they won't debate. You see the ridiculous log rolling that goes on LinkedIn. I mean, people behave out on LinkedIn like they're just terrified of, it's like they're almost afraid not to like an important person's post. It's really a little weird, and it kind of freaks me out. But what I really miss is those kinds of debates. I mean, there wasn't just me and you. There were dozens of people who would regularly engage in debates over every kind of issue. Is the press release dead? Is employee communication dead? Who does an employee want to hear from first? Their supervisor or the CEO? I mean, these were like ongoing professional debates. And you're right, they were limited to the communication world. I wouldn't say, well, you would think that, Shel, because you're beholden to the man, and you're like, no, we were all sort of in this place, and I miss it, and I'm not exactly sure why it's gone, but it really does feel like it is gone. And the only thing I can think of, and the worst reason it's gone, I think, is that we're in a society that's so broken. Like a marriage that's in trouble is like everything. Every fight is about everything. So pass the salt means, oh, you don't like my cooking? No, just I want some salt. And so I do feel like we're in a place where it's hard to have any argument because we're all just ready to make it too big.
Yeah, here's a question from someone Ron Shuchuk. In the corporate world, there are so many obstacles to efforts to understand. What's the starting point for communicators who work in stifling bureaucracy run by committees or toxic cultures?
The starting point is not in that culture. Look, I think that I talk a lot about this. I think of this concept as we can have a better chorus by starting with some duets. And I think if you can find one person you can trust in a corporation, and one person you can partner with and work with who really sees eye to eye with you, then you just make that grow as much as you possibly can. I think one of the problems is that because we have these social media followings, we each have this grandiose idea that we're all a bunch of like columnists who are going to change the world by saying something or sharing the truth. And we don't think of ourselves as humble citizens who really just have some relationships that we can either make better or make worse in our actual real lives, in our work lives, in our home lives, and in our online lives. And I think, we can do a lot by not doing things that make things worse, and by just making relationships that are good, pouring our heart and soul into them, and making the relationships that are troubled but important to us, giving that all kinds of energy. I've got a friend who's been my oldest college friend, and we've really developed some pretty big political differences over the last few years since Trump. And like, we're troubled about it. Our kids are troubled about it. Kids don't compartmentalize this stuff very well. And so we're family, this guy and I. And I feel like what I need with this guy, we used to take long car trips, and then we switched to taking motorcycle trips. I think I need a car trip with this guy to about California, because we have a lot of talking to do. We have a lot of stuff to explore. And it's long form conversations about how we came to our worldview and how we seem to have split in these ways. And so I say pour your energy into relationships that might benefit.
Yeah. Ron says, true, look for the change leaders and support them. And Robert Holland says it's a war of attrition, Ron. And Ron agrees. We've just got less than 2 minutes left. David, I'd like to ask you to sum up your conclusions from the book. What do you hope people take away from the book and do differently?
I think the deepest point that I think I came to in the creation of this book is that, we hear all the time that it's not, we've heard this since we were kids. It's not what you say, but how you say it. Actions speak louder than words. And I think that I came to this place while pulling this book together. And I think you can come to this place by reading this book, where you begin to see communication not as like a function of human activity, but as a lifelong as a life, you come to see your life as one continuous act of communication. That everything you do and everything you never do, and people notice that you never do. This is your life. Your life is one continuous act of communication, and the words you use are usually really just captions for what you're doing, or what you're not doing, excuses for what you're doing or what you're not doing, attempted explanations. But I think if as citizens of a country where it's hard to be citizens in, it's hard to be a citizen of the United States. That's why I think the word effort in this book is so important. It's hard to be a good American citizen in this complicated world. And if you think of your whole life as one continuous piece of communication, as a citizen, as a family member, as a friend, as a colleague, I think you'll behave differently. And I think if you do that, we have a chance at a better and more cohesive society. And as Robert Kennedy said, from the ancient Greeks, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world.
Excellent quote to end with. I want to thank you, David. Thank all the folks who participated live with us today. This streaming technology is actually fairly wonderful. I hope you'll come back and do this again, because we just scratched the surface of the issues that you raised in the book.
We did.
In fact, I've been podcasting with Neville for a long time, and one of the complaints that we hear from listeners is that we always agree. Which is, it was tempting to invite you to join me in a podcast where we don't always agree. But everyone, you can find these interviews, including this one, on the FIR Podcast Network at firpodcastnetwork.com. Look forward to talking to you again, and I'm going to see if I can weasel my way into your session in June, David.
That would be great. You're in, Shel.
Okay, great. Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.